So I thought, Chris, maybe you can start by saying a couple of words about what deep disagreements are, and what distinguishes them from normal or common disagreements.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, as you said yourself at the beginning, there's sort of the garden variety, sort of everyday disagreements, like about, whether the weather is nice or not, or which restaurant you should go to. But then there's also these other disagreements which seem to be grounded in clashes of perspectives. So, something like if someone has a fundamentally sort of, I don't know, religious worldview, and they're trying to explain, um, some fact about the world, and then someone else has a sort of atheistic, humanist or naturalist perspective. The way that they're going to approach certain kinds of questions is going to be fundamentally different. So it's kind of like disagreements emerging out of these clashes of perspectives, or you can even say things like perhaps their disagreements arising out of different like fundamental principles. So, take someone who might be a creationist, they'll have certain principles which just clash with someone who isn't a Christian fundamentalist or young earth creationist, for example. So it's something like worldview disagreement, or disagreements emerging out of clashes between worldviews when worldviews collide, which is not what happens when you're just disagreeing about which restaurant we should go to tonight, or whether we should see a Marvel film, or yeah, a romantic comedy. So I think, I mean, yeah, that's the way I would put it, I guess. Yeah.
So before I give the word to Scott, uh, but it's not just the topic that distinguishes them, right? So of course, the
Sure.
easiest way is to say, well, think about these topics, and everybody's intuition is pumped that those are different kinds of disagreement. But it's not just
Yeah.
that we talk about religion or about pizza that makes the
Yeah.
distinction. Is that connection to that? You called it a fundamental principle. I know there are other concepts, I think hinge commitment or perspective, of however you want to call it. It's that
Mhm.
relationship that distinguishes it, right?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. So, yeah. So then maybe something like what, so I'm trying to be careful here, I guess, because, I'm drawing on a certain theory about what deep disagreements are and trying my best to be as neutral as possible. But yeah, I suppose, yeah, so take someone who is like a young earth creationist, right? So they give a certain degree of authority to the Bible that, maybe an atheist that doesn't give that degree of authority to it, if any at all. So then we would call that like an epistemic principle. So the principle is something like, if the Bible says that such and such is so, well, then it probably is so. Whereas someone of a more atheistic or naturalistic mindset, um, you know, they wouldn't give the same degree of authority to the Bible, and again, if any at all. So they're going to reject the principle that if the Bible says that such and such is the case, then it probably is the case. So maybe there's occasions where the Bible says something is the case, and what it says is really the case, but it's not because because it's written in the Bible, right? Whereas the young Earth creationist or the fundamentalist is going to think that. Yeah, so this then is going to play a role in what the two different figures count as evidence or count as reasons for belief or doubt. So what's going to strike the naturalist as, good evidence for a claim is not the same thing as what the religious fundamentalist is going to count as good evidence or reasons for a claim. So yeah, it definitely is that connection. It's not just about the content of the disagreement, but the source, or the where the reasons or evidence is generated from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Scott, I think where you stand in these definitional issues, and what is your first take on it?
So I think the theories of deep disagreement, and again, Chris is going to have a more capacious perspective on this than I think that I'm going to be able to provide. So I'm going to leave that to Chris to be able to provide all the details of that. But I do think that the theories of deep disagreement are first and foremost going to be explanatory hypotheses as to why certain kinds of disagreements and then the decision procedures that we use to resolve them look like they are hopeless, or at the very least, they seem to be persistent. And on the one hand, we've got one set of hypotheses as to why some disagreements are hopeless and seem to be persistent, and we seem to feel like we're not making progress on them. And that may just be because of the fact that like the folks on one side or maybe on both sides are just pig-headed. They just won't listen to reasons. That there's something wrong with them. And so you might call that a purely cynical account of disagreements. And those kinds of hypotheses are not the hypotheses of deep disagreement. The deep disagreement point is one about a conflict of the reasons behind them. So you might call the cynical view, there's at least one party in a disagreement that makes it so that the reasons that bear on the issue don't resolve the disagreement. So you might call them uncooperative or pig-headed folks. So there's one set of hypotheses, which is just that we're reason resistant. The interesting thing about the deep disagreement hypotheses is that it's in the reasons that make the problem arise between the parties. And so it's in the reasons that we get either the fact of permanent slippage, or you might say persistent slippage. And so what it is about the reasons that don't match up so that we can then, with our reasons, resolve something. And so one of the nice things about theories of deep disagreement is that what happens whenever you see a disagreement as deep is that you're supposed to still be recognizing the rationality of someone on the other side. And so there's something deeply, I guess I'm kind of searching for the right word, but almost aspirational still about theories of deep disagreement.
Optimistic, maybe.
I'm sorry?
Optimistic, maybe.
Yeah, there's something optimistic. There's something anti-cynical about them.
Yeah.
Namely that what you're trying to do in these cases is still recognize the rationality of a set of beliefs and folks for whom your reasons don't seem to penetrate. Still recognize them as rational from some internal perspective to them. And so in that regard, I mean, given my own other philosophical commitments, I think that we owe a lot of dignity to each other as rational beings and things like that. And I think that the theories of deep disagreement that approach persistent disagreements without that cynical eye towards others as folks for whom reasons don't work. Because that's one hypothesis as to why some disagreements are so persistent. These are people for whom reasons don't work. The answer for deep disagreements is that these are folks who have very, very different reasons. And there have to be different strategies of approaching them. And so the normal versus deep disagreement, or I like Chris's garden variety one, because again, I'd prefer to not use a particular set of vocabulary for this. But the garden variety disagreements, for the ones that we've got sort of normal, informal, logical approaches to, are ones that, again, we've got pretty sharp tools for those. The crucial thing about theories of deep disagreement is sharpening tools for people with whom we disagree, that in some ways we even shy away from it because it looks like we can't disagree rationally with them. And so that's the appeal of deep disagreement. I've got one extra thing to say, which is that I think that it's in deep disagreements. One of the great things about deep disagreements and theories of deep disagreements is that we've also got a really great way for us to theorize why philosophy matters. Because in deep disagreements, what's happening is that we in some ways we come into contact with something alien that makes something that's already familiar to us and something that's second nature to us, and we have to make it explicit, and we see it in a different kind of way, and we have to kind of come to terms with that in deep disagreements. And sometimes those disagreements don't have to be that they say yay and I say yay, nay and yay. It's that somebody might just not be completely convinced. that they're like, maybe they're on the fence about it. Maybe somebody's just asking questions and just saying, like, look, I just don't see why we do it this way. It's not that I think that there's another way to do it. I just don't see why we do it this way. And so I think that encounters with skeptics, I think that encounters with Socrates, I think that encounters with between competing philosophical systems are good ways for us to see deep disagreements. And I think that approaching it that way is a good way of maintaining this approach of seeing those for whom your reasons don't reach as still rational creatures is something that I think that we need to maintain, especially whenever it's way too easy to think that the answers are simple and these people are stupid.
Yeah. I think that's. I want to add a few points, and then I'll give the word back to Chris. Maybe it's also a bit of a division of labor between, let's say, psychology or cognitive psychology or social psychology, and the tools that philosophers might use. Because if it's not a matter of being pig-headed, if it's not a matter of being in some other sense, I don't know, irrational or biased, or use whatever word you want to use, then maybe there's some work to be done by philosophers by looking at the type of examples, imaginary or not, that philosophers use, by employing theories, empirical or not, that philosophers use, so on and so forth. So the optimism comes with a bit of a implied division of labor, namely, like you said, it's not that everybody is being irrational or stupid or whatnot. I think what both of you said also highlights the contribution, the possible contribution of disciplines that have to do with argumentation and reasoning. Because in the beginning, in my introduction, I stressed mostly the existence of the disagreement. But immediately, the first step we took was towards the reasons we might or might not use to resolve those disagreements, their effect, they might or might not work to resolve those disagreements, their rationality, so from a normative standpoint, whether they are or are not rational. So it comes as a package, not just, okay, there is a disagreement that is important and fundamental and whatnot, it's a deep disagreement, but also the reasons that we might advance work differently. And now it's on us to say how exactly they work differently. The notion of there being a disagreement on a fundamental principle is maybe a good first stab at it. And I've seen it a lot, and I think it's a first, let's say, response to what is going on. Namely, there's something very deep in the let's say, convictions of the parties that clash, okay? But it's mostly thus, we are concerned with disagreements. I think we're concerned with deep disagreements because the resolution process is somehow different or requires different kinds of tools. Now, I think at one point I will want to call into question some of those things, but I have to say that I think this is a good introduction on what deep disagreements are and what they matter. Maybe before we get too technical about it, maybe I'll ask you a surprise, more personal question. Did you ever have yourself and don't give names and whatnot, but did you ever have yourself the experience of talking to someone and with all your knowledge of epistemology and all your knowledge of philosophy and argumentation theory to think, yeah, but there's no way out of this? Is this something that you've experienced yourself?
Well, I mean, I've had discussions with, Christian fundamentalists, for example, and I think there's, yeah, I mean, so one point here is something like, to engage in rational argumentation and deliberation, you need like a certain degree of common ground with your interlocutor, and then, yeah, with people that are, so I mean, there's a difference between, like, say, a non-fundamentalist Christian having an argument with a fundamentalist Christian, but there is still some common ground, right? They're both Christian, but now, like, take someone who isn't, not a Christian at all. Then when you engage with, like, yeah, the fundamentalists, it can be extremely difficult because what they what they end up drawing your attention to is their conviction in the sort of trustworthiness of the Bible. And if you're of a more naturalistic frame of mind, it's not that it's utterly impossible for the Bible to be trustworthy or reliable. It's just that you want some independent evidence that that's the case, and you're just never going to get that uh, um, with a fundamentalist, right? It's sort of like part of the belief system itself that you just place your trust in the authority of those texts because of what the source is believed to be.
Yeah. Scott, is the deep disagreement part of your everyday life, or are you free from that type of?
So I'm somebody who is I'm very interested in the concept of deep disagreement. I'm somebody who actually thinks that there are no deep disagreements. There are disagreements of depth, and there are disagreements that sort of vary in terms of their depth. But I'm, you might say, an absolute deep disagreement, as in like there's no shared common ground, there's no shared resources for us to be able to think things through. I actually don't think, I think that there are none of those. Or at the very least, have not yet seen evidence that there are none of those, or that class is populated. Part of this has to do, and again, I've got another book co-written with my colleague Robert Talese just down the hall here, titled Reasonable Atheism. And our objective with that book was to say, look, almost all of the examples of that there's a kind of a cognitive divide between religious thought and non-religious thought is incorrect, and that the resistances are really more personal resistances, beliefs in belief, to use a Dan Dennett term, that these are cases where it's not actually the reasons that are the problem, it's certain ways in which we approach ourselves and the way that we weight it. And so reasonable atheism, so my first thought is that I think that a lot of the religious cases are ones that I'm not convinced that those are unbridgeable gaps. I think the very fact of natural theology is a case. The fact of apologetics is a case where I think that on the religious side, they think that they can bridge that gap with us. We naturalists, I should say, I'm assuming something about my audience here, but the naturalists think the same thing with them. I think that in political cases, again, I've done a number of deep dives on trying to think my way into and think along with and understand critical perspectives of, you might say, the far right. And my regular discovery has been that they, for the most part, and again, this was a response that ironically came from one of my reviewers of one of my essays on this, was that almost all of their responses are about how they are alienated from late capitalism. And ironically enough, they recreate a form of Marxism, a Marxist critique of the societies that they're in. They just, you might say, think that the solutions are different, but for some reason they recognize similar problems. Yeah. And so an irony is that I think that a lot of the cases where we have deep disagreements sometimes can be explained by our affective relations to each other. Sometimes we just don't like each other. And let's not forget the simple fact that there are way too many cases where you don't like somebody and you want them to be wrong. And so have you ever met somebody who they start talking, you're just like, I just don't like you. I don't like where you're going. And if they said the sky is blue, your response is going to be, sometimes it's black, that's called night. And sometimes that's red, that's called sunset. And so they can
not
say— Not
me, I'm always rational. I don't know what you're talking about. Not me.
I have that has an effect on me. And so one of the other parts of this is that for as much as I am an aspirationalist about all of this, I think that there is nevertheless a number of cynical accounts of us not being able to bridge these gaps. I think that the reasons are there. I think that sometimes it just requires that we fix something about the way that we access them and hear them whenever they come out of other people's mouths.
Yeah. I think this is a very good moment to look a bit deeper into that idea of that core, or how do we call it, nucleus, or the origin of the deep disagreement, which is the fundamental principle, or the worldview, or correct me if I'm wrong, but Wittgenstein, I think in one of the books, Blue Book or Uncertainty or something like that, uses this idea of a hinge. So those are propositions, or maybe collections of propositions, that are so determining and fundamental of the way we think, that if we don't find a common ground with regard to them, they will trigger, so to speak, or they will hold up a disagreement that is of a different nature. I'm not sure. Maybe again, I'm looking towards Chris, because he is more sort of recently more well versed in this kind of terminological issues. Are we to call them fundamental principles for now, just an umbrella term to capture all these identified core of the deep disagreement? Is that a good term for now?
Yeah, I think it's fair enough, but the only issue with calling them fundamental principles is that as philosophers, we sort of already see them as like something normative, like, you ought to do this or believe this way, or even as an if then, like, if such and such says this, then believe it, right? Whereas the idea for Wittgenstein is that, different kinds of statements or propositions can play a normative role without wearing their normativity on their sleeve. So, for example, the claim that there is an external world, that doesn't look on the surface like a fundamental principle, right? It's rather like kind of a description of, some way for reality to be. But for Wittgenstein, that statement does plays a normative role. That is, it's one of the presuppositions that we need in order to bring certain kinds of reasons into view as reasons for belief or for doubt. So, yeah, I guess the Wittgensteinian idea is that in order for me to sort of take my experience as of my desk in front of me as evidence for believing that my desk is in front of me, I'm sort of already committed to there being an external world, something outside my mind, something beyond my subjectivity. So yeah, the idea is that claim then that there's an external world is playing a normative role, even though it's not on the surface a principle, normative principle, but it plays the role of a principle. So I think that's just the distinction I would want on the table, is it doesn't need to explicitly be a principle to function like one.
But it has to be deep in some sense, right? There has to be some, and now I'm trying to approach the case from the perspective of the philosophers that say that there are deep disagreements. There has to be something different about it. For instance, if we talk now about what kind of a TV we should buy, I'm looking at my TV. If we talk about what kind of TV we should buy, then maybe we agree that we must buy a TV. Now, or maybe we agree on even like a metaphysical statement of the sort of the kind you mentioned from Wittgenstein, like there are TVs, TVs exist, or something like that. But that, there are TVs doesn't really sound like a fundamental principle at that level, whereas there is an external world, or God exists, or something. So, okay, not all normative principles wear their normativity on their sleeves, but nevertheless, this is my impression from the literature, there is a distinction of depth, and the term deep disagreement. Although I have to say, let me add something. This is actually how I got interested in the topic. Maybe I should mention, because I had seen the term a deep disagreement fly about, and I thought, okay, some disagreements are deep. We all know that. But as I started to read in the literature, I figured out that, and you do this very soon after you start. Deep disagreements are not just disagreements that are a bit deeper than normal ones. Let's call them shallow ones, right? So the theories suggest a change of quality at one point, a qualitative switch, whereas the term itself suggests more like a gradual, okay, you have more and more, deeper and deeper disagreement. So that's, for me, this is how I got interested in the term. Reading an abstract, I thought, oh, wait a second, I thought it was just a gradual incremental thing, but it turns out to be a distinction of quality. So now to go back, some principles are, like you say, not necessarily of the you should, you ought to kind, but they're nevertheless regulatory in that sense. But there is this persistent intuition, and I want to insist that there's a switch of kind. There's a qualitative switch at one point. That after some levels of depth is not just more depth, it's a completely different type of principle, right?
Yeah, I mean, yeah. So, I mean, some people think that the depth claim is a bit misleading because when they want to say like, well, there's disagreements about the facts, and then there's like disagreements about how we kind of like conceptualize or how we frame or how we understand the evidence for whatever the facts are. So it's kind of like going a level up. So it's like rather than having a first order disagreement or a disagreement over what the facts are, it's having a higher order disagreement, or in this case, a disagreement about what's the best evidence about what the facts are. So it's kind of like going a level up, but yeah, I mean, I still think the metaphor of like depth is useful, and the reason why is because it's something like, well, it's not deep in the sense that like I hold it dear to myself personally or my community. It's like, kind of like a deep part of who I am. It's not deep in that sense, but it's more like it kind of like grounds a lot of different things, I believe, such that if someone, if I were to, suddenly lose my grip, if I were to suddenly give up my commitment to this this principle or like however we want to call it, my belief, I would sort of like lose my grip on reality, or I'd kind of like it would fundamentally alter my understanding of the world. So I think, that's why saying something like, well, if you were to deny that there's an external world, then that would kind of reconfigure how you think about the world around you generally. It wouldn't just be a couple of like one-off occasions, right? It would be just about everything. But maybe the better case would be like, yeah, like imagine you're in a disagreement with someone who somehow sincerely doubts sensory perception, right? Like how would you make some traction with that person? I mean, so you make a claim and they point out, yeah, but I mean, that claim also is partly based on your sensory experience of things. So, yeah, so it's something like the depth is something like by giving up this kind of belief or this kind of principle, it's going to have like a wide-ranging ripple effect for lots of other things that you think. Whereas, garden variety disagreement, it's not like that. It doesn't have that. It doesn't have that ripple effect. So, yeah, I don't know if that, yeah, maybe that doesn't really speak so much to the depth metaphor, but yeah, I just meant to distinguish between depth in the sense of something one holds dear to the self, or to like one's community, versus something that if they were to give it up, it would have a substantial ripple effect for many other things that they think or believe. Yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. I think I'll give the word to you, Scott, in a second. I just wanted to gradually also introduce the idea of resolution. And I think so the disagreements are deep because there's something there regarding the evidence, or like you said, the meta principles we accept for accepting evidence. And who knows, maybe the meta principle, the doubly meta principles of how we establish principles of accepting evidence, so on and so forth. But I think, again, having reread a bit some of the literature, I think one of the one of the standard endpoints of literature on this topic is, okay, guys, call them however you want, call them commitments, call them principles, doesn't matter. The question is, what do we do about them? I think that is somehow it always ends there. And some scholars have different opinions. Some scholars think that this is in fact resolvable through our natural standard tools. Some scholars think there's other more special tools because the disagreement is deep, so on and so forth. So what you said is in fact relevant for what you do with regard to the resolution question, because if you mutate that small commitment and it has what you call the ripple effect throughout your whole system of beliefs, then I can imagine that there are different tools needed to affect that, rather than, well, this time we're not going to go have pizza as you want, and you know what, why don't you shut up about it because it's not a big thing. You know, that's a more regular thing. It's I in what you said in the beginning, I know, Scott, also, but also from what you've published, that your work also ends up with a discussion on what we do about it. I mean, what's the resolution? Okay, folks, you know, what do you have to say on the resolution topic? Can you say a few words about this?
Yeah. I got three things to say here. One of them is just about, again, I think that the part of the explanatory hypothesis as to what is going on with deep disagreements gives us some clues as to what the resolution procedures should look like. And so I think that indexing your explanatory theory with the kind of hopeful procedures is going to be important. So, so I'm going to say a little bit about the explanatory stuff, and then talk a little bit about the procedural stuff going forward. So, again, if deep disagreements are things that arise from the structure of reasons, then we need a decent theory of the architecture of reasons. And one way to think about deep disagreements is on a kind of a coherentist model, that you might say you've got cognitive systems, and depth, in some ways, the depth of a disagreement is really in some ways the coordinated insideness of the two kind of clouds. Imagine that you kind of got belief clouds, right? And you see that you might say easy disagreements or garden variety disagreements or normal disagreements are ones where it's like the two clouds overlap and they're sort of procedural things inside. Mm-hmm. The issue is that you might say the two clouds either don't overlap or they've got some overlap, and then the nodes of the disagreement are sort of very far apart from where they might overlap. And they're also still central to the clouds. So again, I liked Chris's point, which is that what the stakes of the disagreement are not just I'm right and you're wrong. That if I'm wrong, I have to change my mind about a lot of other things over what we agree. And so the coherentist model is one that, again, that you've got a kind of a central nodes are at issue. And if those central nodes of those belief economies or those belief systems get changed, then a lot of other stuff gets affected by it. And whereas on the outside, you might say on the outside of the clouds kind of can change, not going to change stuff that's going to be a little more global. If you're on a foundationalist model, which is that you might say that beliefs kind of come in a kind of an architecture where you've got a kind of a bottom that's a kind of a foundation, or you've got sort of supporting arches, right? You can change stuff at the top and not have to change the rest of your house, right? It's like I can get a new roof and my living room is still going to be the same. Mm-hmm. But if I have to change my foundation, the house has to in some ways be precariously held in a different way. And in some ways, the architecture of the house has to change. And so on these two models, again, these are two really great models for justification. Another one is an infinitist model, which is that, I'd say reasons just keep going on. That, in fact, on an infinitist model, it looks like if you change any one of those beliefs, a lot of them are going to change. So effectively, all disagreements are deep, or all disagreements are shallow. So we kind of got three different models for, at the very least, our accessible theories of those reasons. And one thought then is that on those very different theories, what kinds of approaches that you've got for resolution are going to vary. Because if you're a coherentist or an infinitist, which is that why questions are always answered with because questions or because answers, and you can say words and there are beliefs and reasons and things like that that support them, then you might say sometimes the solution to deep disagreements is just more reasons. that we can deliberate. And the nice thing about infinitism and coherentism, about, you might say, not just our reasons, but our meta reasons, is that we can continue deliberating about them. There's sort of no endpoint reason, right? Whereas on, you might call, again, Chris has nicely identified a handful of ways of conceiving disagreement. On this hinge proposition or basic principle model, that's a kind of foundationalist model, which is that you've got a kind of a bottom level of your belief system, and that's a kind of a belief about which other beliefs can't change, right? And if there are those kinds of reasons, then it looks like you've got to have other kinds of intrusions, or ways that the reasons that can be given that are not reasons that are spoken out loud, that are going to be non-doxastic reasons. An experience has to be had. An intuition has to be pumped. A kind of, and in some ways, a kind of a change of view has to sort of dawn on them. And those are cases where it's not like those are wordy things, because again, if these are foundational, other words aren't going to change them. There are going to have to be things that are not words that change them. And so depending on your architecture of reasons, different kinds of approaches are going to be necessary. So this is one of the reasons why, in some ways, if we say something like, imagine, whenever we say words like, imagine seeing it from their perspective, what's necessary then is that it's a kind of an imaginative approach to you having different kinds of experiences that get kind of brought up for you with imagination, right? You get a kind of a non-doxastic. It's not a reason that was given to you by another speaking person. It was one that in some ways arose from you from the inside. And that in some ways makes things kind of snap into focus. And so this is one of the reasons why I think literature is really good for us, that we imagine other ways of living, other ways of thinking, and can see it as at home on the inside and see why certain kinds of reasons from the inside are appealing. And so on the one hand, you might say the plasticity of mind, to be able to sort of have an intuition that, you're like, have you ever had intuitions where it's like, but then you say, yeah, but it's wrong? Being able to do that, right? Be able to say, hey, I got an intuition, but now I got a way to think about how to think about it. I got a way to think about how to think about it, is really important. Last point is Chris made another really great distinction, and one that I think is really useful for these discussions, which is a levels distinction, which is that you might say we've got first order things that divide us, first order things that we debate about, and then we often debate how to debate them. And I think that one of the things that we're not yet good at, and we don't yet have very good theories about, is how to argue about arguing, meta argument. And ironically enough, in philosophy, we've got that. We've got meta philosophy, and we do meta philosophy all the time. We talk about how to philosophize, and we train ourselves to philosophize, and we got views about how to explain philosophical disagreements.
We got a journal called Meta Philosophy.
Yeah, we call that meta philosophy. Mm-hmm. And we got a whole journal devoted to it. I mean, and so we're really good as philosophers at thinking about that. But one of the funny things is that it looks like we don't have a lot of good meta argumentative strategies. And you might say even our regular argumentative toolkit is, for the most part, first order stuff. You got the ad hominems, you got the hasty generalizations and things like that. But in some ways, we need a better toolkit for us to be able to think about not just how to argue well whenever we argue about arguments, but where the pitfalls are. And so fallacies of meta argumentation, I think, are good places for us to say, look, even whenever we reason about our reasons, we can still fail at that level, and there can be unique failures at that level. And so I think that one of the pieces of our toolkit yet to be provided is a toolkit for meta argumentation and being able to see errors that we make when not just we reason, when we reason about our reasons.
Yeah. So I wanted to describe very briefly the way I approach matters, because I think it's different from the systems that you described. It's slightly different, but different enough maybe. So the way I see it is that instead of thinking about a deep disagreement as having one architecture, then you can drop the assumption that there is just one disagreement there. Because you see, what unites your systems is that it is one structure, right? One pyramid or one cloud or one line. Whereas whether something is part of the same disagreement or a different disagreement, that's a sloppy thing. We can do that in a variety of ways. So for instance, let's go back to my stupid example. I love stupid examples because I think only stupid examples can reveal how we perceive reality. I think the one in the paper I'm referring to really has to do something with pizza. But the point is, let's say we discuss about going somewhere to have pizza. Now, intuitively, if Chris says, let's go have pizza, and I say, well, pizza is not healthy, and then I say why pizza is not healthy, and then we discuss that, it's part of the same discussion. So intuitively, it's part of the same disagreement. And I understand that. I also, asked quickly, I would give the same answer. But I think in a sense, talking about where to go, talking about health, talking about the reliability of sources on Google Scholar, talking about, like going further, these are different discussions. Now, their architecture is actually, I'm not sure what the best metaphor would be. I really love that cloud because it reminds me of that Lakatos model of scientific research programs. Like you can give up some of the outer hypotheses, but never give up the core. The hardcore of every scientific research program. So I like the onion but then you can also have these simple architectures per question to be answered. So instead of saying we are part of the same disagreement, oh, look how deep it is, you could say we have many disagreements. And what that did for me was it forced me to ask myself very seriously if these unitary, or how do you call them, individual disagreements are not maybe just your garden variety disagreement. So my question, maybe very briefly, not to go too much into this vision, my question, is this a different model or is it just integratable into the typology you described just now?
I really like the idea of thinking of the model of deep disagreements as really more about there being a lot of agreements or a lot of disagreements.
Yeah.
We disagree about a lot of stuff. And maybe a way to grade the depth is, you might say, just the amount of stuff. But I do think that that there's something about, you might say, either epistemic principles or the depth metaphor is supposed to match, you might say, the sort of not just the simple stakes. Where it's like, imagine that we have like a disagreement where I just have to change all of my beliefs about Finland. Look, that looks like imagine that I just had Finland switched up with Sweden, and hey, it happens. Like I live in the South in the United States. We don't teach a lot of geography. It's a joke about the states, blah blah blah. So okay, but let's imagine that I just had Finland and Sweden switched up. So I just have to change a lot of beliefs, right? I'm not inclined to think of that as a deep disagreement. If someone was just like, hey, Aikin, flags are different, it's wildly different languages. So, and you're like, there's a lot of black metal. I see how you make that error there. You're into metal, but that's about it, right? So, it seems to me that there needs to be something other than, you might say, just a bunch of first order things where it's like, if I had Finland and Sweden mixed up, I'd have to change a lot of my beliefs. And that looks like a pretty high stakes change. But I'm not still inclined to think that that's a deep disagreement. Does that make sense? It looks like deep disagreements need to touch on something that's not just a number of propositions. It looks like it needs to change something about, and again, I like Chris's metaphor. It's like, I have to change something about how the world works, not just like where Finland is, right? And so it's a little harder to be able to get that without, you might say, then saying something about, you might say, the what kind of belief structures are at odds there. So I'm pretty sympathetic with the thought. I'm really sympathetic with the onion as opposed to the cloud one, because onions grow from the inside. So that the principles do change. So as someone who thinks that something's going for epistemic infinitism, I think that the onion is a great metaphor where it's like, yeah, you got a cloud of beliefs and still change there. What looks
Chris,
fundamental is still in
I know we've
process.
said many things, but feel free to pick up from any point now.
Yeah, I mean, I did want to just perhaps backtrack just for a moment. Something Scott said, like the different models of the structure of reasons, and yeah, so I do think the coherence model is a it's sort of like a good representation of how to think about what might happen if you are engaged in a deep disagreement, because then the idea would be like, well, what we're pressing upon are the things that are at the center of our respective web of beliefs, and if we were to sincerely give up the things that are in the center, it would have like sort of a ripple effect. It might not reach the periphery, because maybe those things, those are like kind of ever changing anyhow, but it would, well, obviously the center would be removed, and then also the immediate uh, beliefs from there would also have to change. Um, but yeah, then going back to the foundationalist model, I mean, like one way to think about it is that, when if the foundationalist model is correct, then like when two people when two people meet and engage, and if they engage in a deep disagreement, they're both approaching it from the perspective that their belief system has this kind of like like the foundation is reinforced concrete, but they think about their disputant, their interlocutor, as having like a straw hut or like a merely like mud foundation, and that's why it's going to be easy just to kind of change their mind, kind of forgetting that, well, they're they eat they see themselves as having a reinforced concrete foundation, whereas the other views them as having a straw hut. But so I mean, one difference between this foundationalist model though and the Wittgenstein's like hinge model is that although the structure is similar or the same as the foundationalist, the difference is that how you think about what's at the foundation. So for the foundationalist, what's at the foundation are sort of like the like principles that are either like self-justifying, or they're at least like so highly justified that they can support the rest of the beliefs that are standing on top of them. Whereas for Wittgenstein, that's not really the case. So it's rather that like what's at the foundation is really just playing this role of bringing into view what counts as a reason for belief or doubt. But what's in the foundation is not itself justified, but it's also not unjustified. So it's a neither nor situation. Whereas for the foundationalists, what's at the foundation is justified. So although they agree about, the foundationalists and the Wittgensteinians sort of agree about like the structure of rationality or the structure of reasons, they disagree about the epistemic properties of what's there at the foundation.
But wouldn't the foundationalists hesitate to call Wittgenstein's view the structure of rationality? Because then if those elements are themselves not justified, neither
right.
nor, then maybe it's the structure of irrationality or something like that. There's, if you go deep enough and then you open the box, there's nothing there, right?
Well, yeah, that's a great point, but it's not so much that that the hinges are irrational because they're not justified. They're rather irrational.
Yeah.
So they're neither justified nor unjustified. So, in your belief system, you're going to have some beliefs which are justified. You're going to have some beliefs which are unjustified. But you're also going to have, something else, something belief-like that is neither justified nor unjustified.
Mm-hmm.
And then so the thought is, if that is how we think about what we are disagreeing about when we deeply disagree, then it's kind of like no wonder that those disagreements aren't rationally resolved.
What is his example? Is it the one with there is an external reality? Was that from him, or what is his example of this a episteme, or how did you call it, a rational claim?
Yeah. So that there's an external world, but I mean it can be other claims which kind of like play a similar role. But I mean, so for Wittgenstein, he even mentioned things like, I've never been to the moon, right? Which I mean, or no one's ever been to the moon. I mean, so at the time, I guess, that that it was just kind of like outside of like what someone could conceive of being true, perhaps. But what I think is most convincing, because I'm personally not so convinced with the idea that there is an external world is like a hinge commitment or a good example of it, but rather the claim that the world didn't come into existence 5 minutes ago, kind of like replete with like fossils and everything else, and all the molecules and so on. So I think something like that. It's like, yeah, I mean, what kind of worldview would I have if I didn't think that, if I weren't like committed to that? It's like hard for me to really get a grip on and even picture it. But that was the first thing I wanted to say. Just draw out this difference between the Wittgensteinian model and then the foundationalist, despite lots of the overlap. And then the other thing, this is really quick, I wanted to mention was, when you were talking about sort of like the differences between deep disagreement and ordinary or garden variety disagreement. I mean, I think that some ordinary or garden variety disagreement can also be like proxy for a deep disagreement. For example, so you were hinting at this, I think, when you were talking about the pizza example, and then we get to, oh, well, you don't want to go out for pizza because you just think this is really unhealthy. And I think, well, maybe I don't think that. And then we start having disagreements about, like about the difference between like intuition versus science, and then also like the sources and everything else. So there we could say like, okay, in that case, because of the different commitments we have, right? And then it ends up that our disagreements about anything that bears on health will be proxy for some deep disagreement we could have, right? Namely about like the reliability of like nutritional science versus the trustworthiness of like my personal intuition about what's good for me.
Yeah.
Right. So I think the notion of like a proxy disagreement can also be helpful. I mean, also like take the example of like the fetus, like a fetus as a person. Well, what's that proxy for in many cases? Not every case, but in many cases. Well, it's proxy for like a certain kind of religious disagreement, right? So yeah, I mean, I think this like notion of like what's proxy for a deep disagreement, even though we're really, right in the moment we're disagreeing about something ordinary, it's nevertheless suggestive of a deep divide, even if we don't go on to have that discussion.
But do you see these disagreements, again, I'm trying to push the idea of, try to ask what this means for the resolution. If you say these are proxies, and I'm immediately, it sounded like a good description of what's going on. Do you then agree that if we find and touch upon that divide that is deeper and that is the actual disagreement, right? Which is that you might think, let's give it a formulation, you might think that it's always good, it's always preferable to eat healthy if you can, and you might think, well, you also have the little joys of life or whatnot, right? So let's say that's the actual disagreement. Do you then accept the consequence of this view that if you find some other common ground to solve that, maybe even evidence, you agree upon some sort of test, and then you walk together towards the location where the test takes place, and you see the results of the test, and then you somehow are convinced one way or the other, then there's a rational way towards resolving deep disagreements. The scary thing was that there's no rational way to resolve these, whereas if there is something there that can be tackled with argument or evidence or test or whatnot, whatever we use to resolve our disagreements, then we're back to optimism. We thought it's not resolvable. It turns out that it is. It was just a proxy, right? Are you then committed to that as well? Not you, but I'm saying as a scholar, also
right,
you. But
yeah. Well, I think there's like at least two senses of resolution or even rational resolution in play that will be helpful to just make clear for a moment. So like one way of thinking about a rational resolution to not just a deep disagreement, but any disagreement is just simply adopting the attitude that is required by epistemic rationality. So the idea would be like, well, you believe that eating pizza is healthy, and I I disagree. I don't believe that. Well, what does rationality say here? So then maybe it would be something like rationality says go to the evidence. So then the question becomes, well, what does the evidence tell us? And if you think that the evidence uniquely points towards a certain conclusion, then what the rational resolution would be for both of us would be just to adopt whatever attitude is recommended by the evidence. If it's to believe that eating pizza is healthy, then that's what we should both do. If that's not the case, then that's what we both don't do, and then we say disbelieve it. Or if the evidence like is not sufficiently clear and rich, then we both ought to suspend judgment. So that would also be so in either of those cases, it would be a way of rationally resolving it. It's just kind of like, well, what does rationality require of us? Just change your attitude to whatever fits with what the norms of rationality say. But when I like tell this to students, they're like, okay, this is like maximally unhelpful, right? you're not gonna this because I mean what people are looking for is some kind of like inner procedure like that they can follow, and also something that they can deploy to convince their interlocutor, right? And like what I was talking about, that first sense of rational resolution, has no traction there. Yes, we're so looking for something else. I think that at least if we bring back the Wittgensteinian model for a moment, I think going the route of like argumentation and even trying to not just give epistemic reasons for what you believe, but epistemic reasons which are also kind of like compelling or persuasive, that might not be a sufficient procedure either, because on the Wittgensteinian model, what is going to strike you as compelling or what's going to strike you as persuasive is already fixed by or framed by your hinge commitments or your framework commitments. So even going that route is probably not going to work out. If it does work out, it's kind of like accidentally, right? Like the person happened to be persuaded, but not necessarily in virtue of, no, not necessarily because they ought to have been or because they should have been persuaded, right? They might just happen to be persuaded, so it's an accident. Yeah, but otherwise, I would like to. So I know, like Scott, you do a lot of work on, argumentation. So I'd like to see, what you say about this. So like, just like this distinction, and also what would be maybe a pathway to how to like rationally resolve deep disagreements in a richer sense, insofar as such disagreements even exist.
So I think that one of the things, and part of this is about meta argument also, which is we argue about how we argue about what's relevant to the argument. One of the other things that, in fact, I worry about theorizing deep disagreements is that in some ways it's kind of like the worry about theorizing polarization. The better we theorize it, the more we talk about it, the more then it infects the way that we talk about how we talk about things.
Yeah.
And and here's the good news and bad news about polarization talk, and then we'll get to deep disagreement. Nobody's happy about the fact that we're polarized. Everybody's unhappy. But the problem is that then whenever they talk about how polarized we are, they generally mean how polarized they are.
Yeah.
So polarization, the irony is that the tool that we've got to, in some ways, theorize our situation becomes a bludgeon, becomes a truncheon, becomes a way of being able to diagnose and make the situation worse. Okay, so that's a little object lesson. My worry is that a similar thing happens with deep disagreement, especially if we're deep disagreement pessimists. If you've got like a little bit of deep disagreement pessimism, and that, like, I mean, again, if you read that classic Vogelin essay, there's a lot of deep disagreement pessimism. He thinks that argument's impossible in cases of deep disagreement. I call that strong pessimism. It's not just that argument's like pointless and it doesn't make any progress, blah, blah, blah. No, he just thinks that argument's impossible in those kind of cases. And then he says we have to turn persuasion. Now, Chris has got like a little bit like, I have a much darker read on what persuasion means in light of that. It's like, what's persuasion if it's not argument? what is that, right? Like, it sounds like persuasion's just a nice word for manipulation now, because persuasion, like, I don't know what we're talking about. So my first worry is that deep disagreement pessimism comes with two worries. One is that the concept of deep disagreement, because we are hasty generalizers, because we have pretty dark perspectives on each other, because of the fact that we use the concept of polarization as a truncheon and usually about them, is going to be cases where I think that we just over-identify deep disagreements. I think that we make things worse. This is a bad news for us scholars. We make things worse the more that we theorize deep disagreement. Why? Because we put that concept into play, and when we put that concept into play, people are going to use it, and they're going to use it to short circuit disagreements that they could otherwise resolve. Yeah. That's point one. So I think that there's a bad looping effect that happens with our concept of deep disagreement, which is that we will over attribute it. And it happens with Vogelin. Like, again, because I'm a deep disagreement monopolist, I think that everybody overuses the concept of there and say, this is just irresolvable. Vogelin's like, yeah, it turns out that like all these cases of abortion are just like, and they're very simple arguments. It's like, yeah, like that looked like an impasse in 1980. Nice. Yeah, but that argument's gone on. He thinks that argument's not possible. It's like, you should see the journals, bro. Like, okay. Yeah. So my first thought is that like the concept of deep disagreement comes with a price, which is that especially if you're a pessimist about it, it comes with a price, which is that you are going to over attribute it. You are likely to over attribute it. Even if you're a pessimist, you're still going to think that there are deep disagreements. There are going to be deep disagreements that are not resolvable, and other disagreements that are resolvable, and you're going to misattribute it. So I think that that's just one of the prices of it, that we've just got a vicious loop with the concept of deep disagreement. The second one is that I think that even in cases where we've got deep disagreement, one of the approaches is a kind of a Socratic approach. Notice, by the way, that Socrates never says, well, it looks like we've got a deep disagreement. I just fundamentally disagree with you there, Gorgias, or there, Callicles, or there, Thrasymachus. It's pretty clear he does, and especially with Thrasymachus, he wants it to be very clear.
Exactly. I wanted to say Thrasymachus does say that. I mean, he walks away at one point, right?
So yeah, enjoy your banquet of words here, Socrates.
Yeah, exactly.
But notice something about this. All the way that Socrates argues isn't to import new principles, though. A little hint to the side, the whole reason why they have to have the rest of the Republic is because it doesn't look like he does. But Socrates, for the most part, argues ad hominem, not calling them jerks and say they have bad breath, but to say, hey, I know your beliefs. I see an inconsistency here. How are you going to fix that? Notice, by the way, that you don't need anything other than, you might say, just the principle of non-contradiction, which most belief systems run on, or at the very least, if they don't run on it, they run on something very close to it. That you might say, the desire for consistency is something that can drive a good deal of belief change and commitment change, even without external reasons. Again, it doesn't tell you which of the two to go with, but it does say that you can't have both. And so one kind of Socratic approach is to say, hey, it looks like you got an inconsistency here. And then to kind of give a little wink and be like, again, I think that certain kinds of non-doxastic stuff is relevant to our belief management. So that's my theory. When Socrates, the Socratic thought is, hey, it looks like you've got an inconsistency here, and it might be this one. Wink. That's the problem. So I think that there are, even if you think that there are deep disagreements, I think, and you're even a deep disagreement pessimist, there are still tools. There are still tools where it's like, look, we may not be able to resolve the disagreement, but it does look like we can still see each other as reason responsive. We don't have to hold each other in contempt. We can still see each other as the kind of people that are holding their beliefs and holding all these sorts of things because of the reasons that they've got and they're thinking things through. Our fellows and our fellow citizens are not like bad weather. And the more that we are committed to that kind of program, to seeing our fellow citizens as like reasonable people with whom we can co-govern, instead of like things that are impassive, that for which reasons they're just not reason responsive. That's a better principle to run a democracy with. It does sort of make us beholden to the folks on the fringes, but that's kind of what it is to hold. What it is to see others as your political leaders. And one last thing to say, which is, I think that disagreements. I mean, I'm kind of one of those folks who think that disagreements can be meta evidence. I think that when people say not P, I think that's evidence that there's some evidence, or that there's evidence that I'm misunderstanding my evidence. I think that that meta evidence can be evidence because it's evidence that there's evidence. And so I think that one of the nice things about deep disagreements is that it's evidence of the fact that we need to be in better control and better reflective relationship to whatever sort of heavy duty things are running the show for us. And so I like epistemic principles. Again, I think that Chris has nicely theorized this division between these sorts of programs. I'm inclined to think that like our meta reasoning we need evidence we have evidence that our meta evidence is out of order, out of sync. We need to think a little bit more clearly about that. And so we need to be in touch with our epistemic principles and clarify them. And so given the fact of deep disagreement, given the fact of disagreements that we're attempted to call deep, those are cases that, again, cause us to be reflective. And again, I think that this is, as I said at the very beginning, this is just a nice case for us to say, you know what? This is an easy entree to say, often our disagreements with each other are philosophical disagreements. How are we going to get better at handling these disagreements? How about some philosophy? You know what? The reason why our democracies are having such a hard time is because of the fact that we don't know how to philosophize. We need to be better at philosophizing. We're really good at being able to build tanks and to be able to build widgets and to be able to build all sorts of communication technology. And then we get on them and we're terrible at it. Why are we surprised at this?
I think we could have 2 more meetings or 3 more meetings on everything you said, but I want to pick up and add something to it. I think part of what constitutes being rational when deep or disagreement in general, but specifically or even especially when deep disagreement arises, is that you don't miss chances of deciding matters based on what you both might accept as evidence. So for instance, I think the example I give is that, okay, if we're in a room and we talk about how many chairs there are in the other room, then both of us, all 3 of us, we're all 3 degrees in philosophy, will be equally irrational if we keep debating, as opposed to just walk towards the room and check how many. That's, by the way, what I don't sometimes like about Socrates. Socrates always wants to decide matter in dialogue. Like walk back to Pireo, whatever. I don't know what the name is in English, but you know that's how the Republic starts with. I went down from Piraeus. Yeah, go back, man, and see what they were doing with the god. And then, anyway, so sometimes being rational is just stop talking about it, agree on this experimentum crucis, and if it's there, use it. But of course, a lot of things will not be like that. So I think what then is the next best thing. And I wanted to add this right away because it ties into what you say about, you know, being good at philosophy. I'm not sure if this is a philosophical skill, but it's the kind of skill you're more likely to develop in philosophy classes. And that is keeping to that search for what Chris just now called the actual disagreement as opposed to a proxy for something else. So keep going deeper is a skill, as opposed to coming up with other ideas and other themes and reshaping the original standpoint and making a hot mess out of it. Going deeper and deeper, I gave the example of, okay, we're gonna go pizza. Okay, the next thing is it healthy? The next thing is what sources are we believing in? The next thing is how do we know when we have sufficiently scanned the sources, et cetera, et cetera. That kind of honing in on something that is hopefully at one point that core disagreement, that's a skill. I'm not good at that. I know from my personal life that I should probably be better considering my background, but I know, and I'm not good at that. And I also, how do I know this? When I manage to do that, either in, let's say, practical discussions at work or personal discussion, when I manage to do that, it's always for the better of the discussion and even psychologically the feeling of those involved. Like we're going down the pyramid. Let's use that for now. You know, we're going down towards the bottom of the pyramid, not just out of the pyramid, some other pyramid, a smaller pyramid there. You know, that's kind of I guess a bit the conclusion that might help, in dealing with this. If you want to figure out, and one more thing, and then I want to give back the word to Chris. I think argumentation, exchanging arguments, but again, directed in this way. So let's go deeper and deeper to see what separates us. Argumentation might sometimes not. What did I want to say? Might not always. That's what I want to say. Argumentation might not always lead to a resolution, but if it continues this direction, then it has this explorative function of figuring out what the actual disagreement is, because we're now in a room trying to agree on how many chairs there are in the other room. But if we don't have to immediately walk to the other room. That's where the experimentum crucis is, and I think that's rational to do. But through argumentation, we might figure out how come we came up with these two different beliefs. So argumentation sometimes has an exploratory function rather than a resolution function. Namely, by trying to convince the other, you might figure out that what the actual disagreement is, right? So I think that's another way in which I'm also connecting one more thing, in which I'm also going to focus in, because I start with that idea. Argumentation never works. Yes, argumentation sometimes don't work, but they might be just the explorative tool you need to get to that impossible to solve through argumentation dissensus, which you might solve through evidence and testing and some sort of other non-discursive tools. Chris?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're both right that having some kind of substantial self-knowledge about what our most fundamental commitments or epistemic metaphysical principles or moral principles are, would be really helpful in the case of deep disagreements. And I even think like it's just extremely difficult for anyone to even know what they are. It takes like a lot of critical reflection and even like the right kind of like social conditions and the right kind of environment. One thing that Scott said that I agree with, although I'm not so optimistic about it. So you mentioned that, well, one thing that might be helpful for resolving deep disagreements would be something like a principle of consistency. We all want to be consistent, and when you point out to someone, oh look, here's this like inconsistency, they're alarmed. The trouble though is that we're motivated still when we see the inconsistency to resolve the inconsistency by preserving what we already think, right? So there's like the famous example of this is in When Prophecies Fail. And this is like was a social psychological study, I think done in the late 50s even, of this like kind of UFO, New Age, apocalyptic religion. And so it was one of their beliefs that there was going to be this apocalyptic event and that the UFOs were going to like kind of rescue them. And then of course, lo and behold, the apocalyptic event, I think it was a flood, doesn't come to pass. No UFOs. Okay, so what happened? Well, some people indeed, changed their fundamental convictions. They go, okay, well, this is all baloney. But actually, though, a lot of people, especially the people who are kind of like the most embedded in the program, most embedded in this group, they doubled down and they said, well, I'm going to just add a new belief which renders this what would otherwise be a disconfirming evidence. Add a new belief which makes it compatible with my initial set of beliefs. So that's my worry about consistency. It's like, yes, we do want to have consistent sets of attitudes or beliefs, but we're motivated to preserve the ones that are central to our worldviews. So we're going to interpret disconfirming evidence in a way that aligns. We're going to add, or put it another way, we're going to add new beliefs to our worldview that renders consistent the otherwise disconfirming evidence with our prior set of beliefs. So that was my worry for that. But otherwise, though, I am completely on board with the thought that, yeah, there should be, yeah, we should have some more, critical reflection and even just self-discovery, just kind of finding out what is it that I'm actually most fundamentally committed to. I mean, it's like not obvious. It's not like, yeah, it's not like the example of going into the room and we're asked like just count how many chairs are there, right? It's more like if I kind of like search the deep dark caverns of my mind, I'm not really like bumping into my fundamental commitments. I'm not really. So actually, yeah, it does take dialogue to kind of like maybe unravel what those commitments or convictions even are and what role do they even play in my belief system. So I definitely think, yeah, kind of like civil dialogue would be a good thing. Um, yeah, that's all I would have to say about that, I think.
I'm afraid we have to slowly go towards, or maybe not even that slowly, go towards the ending of this meeting. Maybe since we both were the last speakers, maybe Scott, you want to add a last note to it?
Yeah,
Or
sure. So again, I really appreciate the time that you had, that you put into getting us together. I appreciate the time with you, Chris, Eugene. Super conversation. I think that there's just one last kind of question that sort of bothers me about deep disagreement stuff. Again, Chris's point about the rationalizing with these sorts of cases is really well taken. Bjorn Halson has got a whole bunch of information about the more people know about the area in which they disagree, the better that they are at being able to handle counter evidence. And so it turns out that it's not a surprise; it's just better at rationalizing. The more you know. So, but I've just kind of got this background kind of puzzle about some deep disagreements because again, I think that disagreements are evidence about your evidence. That there's a trouble and you need to be able to resolve it. A lot of this just depends on whether or not you think that evidence really whether or not the evidence that you've got and whether the evidence that you share can support only one appropriate belief attitude. And so if you are committed to what's called the uniqueness thesis, which is just that, hey, whatever evidence set there is going to support one and only one attitude. Either you should believe it to whatever degree that it supports it, you should disbelieve it, or you should just suspend judgment. So the uniqueness thesis is just that there's just one and only one attitude that you should take towards your evidence. And I think that there's something really appealing about that thought. That's why we search for evidence. It's determinative, things like that. But nevertheless, we still approach the thought that, and so that's on the one hand, there's something right about that thought. On the other hand, there's another kind of what's called epistemic permissivism, which is that, hey, a set of evidence can actually, there can be two or more belief attitudes that are rationally appropriate given your evidence. And that can be because of some other evidence weighting considerations or urgency or stakes cases where you might say you agree about the evidence, but you disagree about the stakes. And so on the one hand, there's something right about that thought too. And so I'm as someone who's thinks skepticism looks really good. I'm unsure as to even what kind of epistemic principle looks right to me. And notice, by the way, the deep disagreement cases are ones where if you're committed to a version of the uniqueness thesis and this meta evidence requirement or thought that I had, which is that disagreements are evidence that your evidence is incomplete or that you haven't quite successfully resolved them, there is a hopeful response to this, which is that in deep disagreements, we should all suspend judgment. And so if you're committed to a version of that, it's like, yeah, they've got all the evidence. They've just, we've got, or maybe there's evidence that I just can't understand that they've got, or they've got meta epistemic principles that I don't have any good arguments against, and it looks like they're determinative for them against me. There is one hopeful way out of this, which is skepticism, which is that in cases of deep disagreement, we should actually suspend judgment.
When in doubt, suspend judgment.
When in doubt.
When in doubt,
yeah.
I think.
And so I think that a kind of epistemic humility in those kind of cases is actually a good policy.
Yeah. There's in more my field in science and technology studies, there's Sheila Yasanov who wrote about technologies of humility. That made me think of that, technologies of humility. The idea being that philosophy and technology and responsible research and innovation and ethics of technology are there to make scientists and policymakers a bit more humble about science or what technology can do. It's a bit like this, a bit more humble about what your belief system can do for you if somebody else disagrees. And I think I also want to go back very briefly as my final remark to what Chris said, because I think it's very important, and I missed that in my examples, that sometimes it's your identity that is at stake. And I would say what we are also, and when I say we, I mean mostly me, what we're also bad at is to find a compromise that is outside the disagreement. And I think, Scott, you might think of that distinction between resolving and settling, from pragmadialectics. Resolving is when we exchange argument, and that's the battle of the minds. Settling is, okay, we don't agree on this. How can I still be your friend? I'm super simplifying, but that's basically the idea, right? How can we collaborate and live our lives so that we don't get at each other's throat for this every single time we meet or every single time, that kind of strategy and that kind of skill, again, it's a bit of a craft to find this sort of Nash equilibrium type of understanding of each other in which you definitely don't agree. You don't agree the more because of it, but you find a way to, live without, all men against men, that kind of warlike situation. I think that's also a skill that we can develop more and to be optimistic about. Chris, any last remarks? Any last remarks? As if
just very.
It sounds a bit dark.
It made me think of something. I think Scott, your colleague Robert Talese said. But it's like, well, maybe we should stop talking and go gardening. Right, that actually, if there really is a deep divide between us, and perhaps argumentation and trying to settle it through dialogue isn't really the right path, but rather the right path is something practical. Go have a pizza together, go garden together, go for a run together, and something like that.
Yeah. I was going in the same direction. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, and I'll say one last plug for my colleague Rob Talese's work. He's now got a new research program called Democratic Solitude. And the thought here is that we actually are better together whenever we can be alone. And so the problem of politics is that it becomes everything. What you need are things that make politics worthwhile, that are not politics. And so one of the things that he thinks that there's now some research showing that when you think about things that are not political, so a simple example is someone asked the question after having read Aristotle's Politics, would he be a Republican? Like, think about something that's just thinking about an issue that's just not going to bear immediately on some hot take actually makes you better at being able to think about the things that are pressing. And so that's an interesting approach, which is that one of the best ways for us to be friends is to not say, hey, let's be friends. Is to find things that are worth doing together.
Now, speaking of apolitical subjects, I have a kid to pick up from daycare. So I will wrap this up and thank you very much. This has been as exciting as I had expected, and hope to see you soon. By the way, Scott, as I said, I will be in Nashville.